welcome to Woodlands and Wildflowers. I really love doing this talk, so I hope you'll enjoy it too. I was telling Serenella that this is a talk that I've given in the past, particularly at the nature centre I work at, which is Irvine Nature Centre outside of Baltimore. In the springtime, and so there was quite a lot of emphasis on spring ephemerals, but I've changed the ending of the talk to make it seasonal and bring in lots of talk about what happens in the autumns in woodlands. I use this talk to talk about an area that I've looked after at the Irvine Nature Centre for about the last 4 years. I'm in charge of a woodland garden that's a fenced area. So it's kind of like what's been happening at Wood End since they've put in the deer fence, but this is areas just an acre, and it's been there for over 10 years now. So it's allowing us to look at what's happening within an area when we exclude deer. And then we also do plant in the garden to bring back plants that might be there if it wasn't for the fact that this is a pretty recently converted woodland. So it's changed from agricultural fields back into woodlands about 40 years ago. So some of my pictures tonight are from those woodlands, but I also expand to other areas in Maryland that we're going to talk about. So why is a woodland? Why woodland? Well, woodlands are a really great place to actually live if you're a plant. They have, for the most part, pretty deep, rich soils, and they have a moderated environment. So you have more moisture and more constant temperatures through the year. So compared to plants that live out in an open meadow area, they have, more equitable climate to live in. But the one thing is, unless you those trees that causing the canopy, then you've got to adapt to actually live in the shade of the deciduous forest in Maryland. And what I'm going to talk about today is the way that these plants have adapted through lots of different methods to living in shade. And some of the plants, animals that depend on these plants. So let's see how this goes. Okay, I'm going to start with one of the adaptations that one of our earliest flowering plants in the springtime is. So this is skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus fetidus. So its name tells you all about the bad smell that this plant produces. For some people, it just kind of smells like a garlicky mustard smell, and for other people, it's really, really repulsive. And different plants have different amounts of smell that come out of them. So for some people, though, it does have that skunky smell. And it actually is a deterrent both of being eaten, but also an attractant. So when these plants bloom, it's in as early as late January, and around here, I usually see them by early February actually blooming. And the plants are in the same family as things like Jack in the Pulpit. And they have something that's called a spathe and a spade. So the outside part, the spathe, is a covering that goes around the fruiting body that's within. And if you've ever felt these plants, they're pretty cool. They're outside. If you actually kind of rub it in your fingers, it has this very strange kind of squeaky texture, and it feels like a styrofoam cup. It's kind of spongy, and that's because its job is to insulate the flower that's within. Because this plant does something called thermogenesis. So through cellular respiration, it actually raises its temperature, and it's incredibly efficient at doing this. So in some studies that were done, they found that it could raise its temperature by about 20 to 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 Fahrenheit, is how much it raises its temperature above the surrounding air temperature, which is, pretty incredible for a plant that we, normally think is just a kind of passive thing. And it does this for a couple of reasons. So traditionally, we've always felt that this was to make a really nice, warm, cozy little area inside the spadex, where pollinators could come in and they'd be attracted by that warmth, which will release lots of volatile chemicals. And the chemical smell that's coming out is this like smell of bad smell that's related, supposed to smell like putrefying animal. And the red appearance is also supposed to look like carrion emerging from, a winter snow cover or something like that. So this plant attracts animals like the flesh flies, which are so aptly named the sarcophaga flies, to come in and pollinate it. And it has been noted that sometimes honeybees that are out as on nice days as well will actually go visit these plants, and they actually will go inside and use them as a little rest stop to warm up, like we might on a cold day, just nip inside, warm up, and then they'll fly off to another skunk cabbage. So the plants themselves are pretty interesting looking. If you ever peek inside them, the spade looks a bit like a pineapple to me. It's like got this like pineapple look, and they have little tiny things that are called tepals because they're indistinguishable. You can't tell if they're petals or sepals, so they're just called petals. And when it gets pollinated, these turn into kind of like a fleshy seed. And if you've never seen what that looks like, it's quite an interesting protuberance that comes out of the ground is the winter look. So it kind of looks, I guess, a bit like Indian corn or something like that is the look of it. And the seeds just kind of fall off and will germinate right there, often next to the adult, or sometimes they're carried away by flowing water a few feet away from the adult. The other thing that's really cool about this plant that I really like is it has contractile roots. So if you ever dig up and look at the roots of a skunk cabbage, the roots are kind of all wrinkly, and that's because the roots contract to pull the plant down into the ground. So every year it actually contracts a couple of millimeters down into the ground to make sure that the flower is always just exactly at soil level. So it's never like grows any taller. And once it's finished flowering, the leaves will actually start to emerge like this. So they come out and they kind of unroll until very quickly they get this incredibly lush display of leaves. They can be up to a foot across. Now these leaves, you don't ever want to try eating them. They have a calcium oxalate in them, which is a sharp crystal. So if you try chewing it, as well as tasting really bad, it has quite a sharp feel in your mouth, almost like kind of little pieces of glass in your mouth. But which deters most herbivores. So you rarely see it being eaten like around here in the Baltimore area, because we don't have the animal that will actually eat it in really large amounts, which is the black bear. So it seems like this is not like a really like desirable food, and I'm sure even to black bears it doesn't taste great. But a study found that in spring, in years following when there was no oak mast, so if there was no acorns produced by oak trees, then in the springtime bears are really short of food. And somebody that did studies on bears by collecting bear scat actually found that their diet in springs following mast failures could be up to 99% skunk cabbage. So they're, it's a really important food source in springtime for these black bears. We also have there's a couple of Lepidoptera that will eat the leaves. This is a ruby tiger moth that eats the leaves. But for the most part, they don't look that damaged. But within a really short amount of time, just a few months after emerging, about 4 months, the leaves will be there. If you watch them, they kind of just disappear and they kind of dissolve and slime in place. And by that means they think that they keep all the nutrients right in the soil surrounding the plant itself. So it's then able to reabsorb all those nutrients to do all this energetic thermogenesis the following spring. Okay, so that's one of the ways of adapting to living in the shade, is by having thermogenesis, they can start growing really, really early in the spring. So another adaptation that many of our flowers do is to be ephemeral. And so to be ephemeral, flowers means that you're kind of like the hair of the plant world. You're going to try and race through producing your leaves and flower and seed, all in this tiny narrow window of time from when the ground warms up and before the trees leaf out. So around here, that usually means like about 4 weeks of growth that spring ephemerals have, when they're going to get the sunlight coming through the trees before they actually grow their own leaves. So one of the plants that does this is spring beauty. We've got lots of other ones, but I like looking at spring beauty because it's one of the plants that has its very own specialist bee. And anyone that knows me probably knows that my main area of research is bees. So a specialist bee is a bee that only collects pollen from one particular flower. Usually it's like the whole genus that they do it, sometimes a few more than just a single genus of flowers. And for us in this area, the spring beauty bee, the Andrena erigini, only collects from the spring beauty flower, the Claytona virginica, because that's the only one in that genus in our area. And it means that this bee has to time its emergence for that tiny narrow window of time when the spring beauty emerges and is flowering. So it's just a few weeks that we have spring beauty flowering. So they have to make sure that they emerge and collect all the pollen that they need to feed the next generation while those flowers are flowering. So it might seem, in a lot of ways, the cost of doing this can be on the specialist bee because they're utterly dependent on that flower. If the flower disappears because of habitat loss, or in my previous talk, I talked about invasive plants taking over spring beauty territory, then your only source of food for your larvae gets lost. So it's definitely that specialist bees, and just like specialists of any kind, are always the most at risk for plants and animals for if we have habitat loss or invasive species. But oops, sorry, just trying to make sure I got my notes. But although they do go only to spring beauty to collect pollen, they will collect nectar from other flowers. So if there's like bloodroot or toothwort or something else around, they will do that. So it's kind of like how I'll stop at any coffee shop to get my coffee in the morning, but I might only buy, my babies the best food from Whole Foods or something. So they're very specialized for their larvae, but for their own feeding, they are still generalists. So it's, in some ways, it's not a bad life being a spring beauty bee though, because they wake up and they immediately start collecting pollen. And they're so efficient at collecting their pollen that they've actually usually taken all the pollen off the flowers within a few hours. So the average working day for a spring beauty bee is only 2 to 4 hours. And if it's rainy, the flowers will be closed up. So they just stay home, snug in their little homes and sleep. We're talking of homes, these are ground nesting bees. They build a tunnel down into the ground and they build little chambers off of the tunnel where they pile up piles of the pollen and lay their eggs on those. And that's where these bees, the bee larvae, will develop. And then the bee larvae go into their pupa and stay in their pupa for most of the, until the fall. And then I think they go into the pre-pupal, pre-emergent state for the winter, and then emerge the following spring. So it is an interesting life as a spring beauty bee, because you spend most of your life underground as a larva or a pupa, and then you just fly for a few weeks while you're collecting food. So it always used to be thought that this was a great thing for a plant when you have a specialist bee, because you have a pollinator that's going to come and only visit your flowers and collect your pollen, and isn't going to then take your pollen and waste it by taking that pollen off to a bloodroot or a toothwort or another flower where it can't do its pollinating. But actually, recent studies have shown that these specialist bees are kind of, like a double-edged sword for the flowers, because they're actually so efficient at collecting the pollen. And a recent study done in Virginia and Maryland, they saw that these specialist bees, on a single visit to the flower, they can remove between 60 and 80% of all the pollen in a single visit. And they also focus on visiting male flowers to collect that pollen. So they make 2 visits to male flowers for every 1 visit to a female flower. And when they do go to the female flower, they actually aren't that good at losing the pollen. So only 2% of the pollen travels with their visits to 2% of all the pollen that they collect actually gets moved over to the female stigma. And it's interesting because some other flower visitors, like the bee fly is another big visitor of these flowers. They actually transport like 4% of the pollen on each visit to a female flower, because they're like, the pollen for them is just like an accidental, it just sticks to the fur and then falls off. So they're actually like a better transporter of pollen. So the flowers have had to adapt by like limiting their release of pollen, so that the specialist bees can't just come and strip all the pollen and take it away to feed to their babies without having, doing the job that the flowers want of pollinating. So lots of these relationships that we kind of think as very mutualistic, helping each other out, is that both of the animals are actually, both the animal and the plant are in it for their own benefits. And sometimes, like it does help out the other plant, but there's also a lot of costs on, the plant in this case, that they have to produce a lot of pollen because of how much the specialist bee removes. And just to show you how much pollen they can carry away, this is the pollen sac on this spring beauty bee, just full of pollen. Okay, there's another really cool relationship in that these spring ephemerals want to spread their seeds, and the way they do it is they form what's called an elaiosome, which is a lumpy handle on the plant, on the seed, sorry, that's made of lipids and proteins that make the seed very attractive to ants. And so ants will come along, collect these seeds and carry them back to their nest. This used to be thought of as like a mutualistic relationship. So the ants collect the seeds, carry them to the nest, they strip off this elaiosome, the fatty part, which they feed to their larvae. And then when they're finished, they take and throw the seeds away, and they might throw them into their midden heap or compost heap, so that the seeds are like actually dumped in an area that's full of lots of nutrients for the seeds to grow. But more recent study has actually been looking at exactly what benefits both of these plants, both the plants and the ants get from this relationship. Now, it's undoubtedly true that this is really beneficial for seeds, because around the world, about 3,000 different plants have all converged on this method of dispersing their seeds. So there's been at least like 100 different times that this relationship has evolved in plants. But what we now think is actually just as important as like the carrying and spreading the seeds around is that ants live in like really concentrated ant heaps with lots and lots of members. And when you're living in those like close conditions, one of the highest risks for ants is actually the spread of disease and fungal spores. So they have a gland on them that actually produces like an antifungal agents. And these metapleural glands will spread the antifungals all over the ants. And when the ants handle the seeds, they actually discovered that this coating actually goes on the seeds, so the seeds get an antifungal coating. So the biggest cause of mortality of seeds, particularly in woodlands that are like moist, warm environments, is actually fungal development on the seeds. So that's those fungi that Serenella like so much are actually killing most of our seeds. And in studies, like 90% of seed mortality is caused by these fungal attacks. So by getting an antifungal coating, it's like hugely increasing the success rate for germination of the seeds. And so that's the real benefit that seeds are getting from being handled by ants. Now, it's really interesting. A study was done not too long ago of the ants. So I'm trying to remember, Warren. So a guy named Warren did some studies on this relationship and what was happening to the ants that collected these heliosomes. And when he looked at it, he actually realized that this relationship probably isn't mutualistic. And it was really funny because he got a lot of pushback because people really love the idea that the world is full of this. The plant is feeding the ant and the ant is planting the seed, and they're both like living in this happy utopia together. But when they actually did the studies, when they looked at it, nests that had higher levels of these seeds that have lysosomes in their nest actually had higher mortality rates and were less healthy than nests that didn't contain these seeds. So what they decided was that the lysosomes actually are kind of like great junk food that really attracts ants, but they're not great food to feed and raise healthy larvae. So it's kind of like, why do the ants bring back these seeds if they're not great food? Well, the seeds have a thing in it called oleic acid. And one of the best known naturalists ever is a guy called E.O. Wilson, who studied ants. And he actually isolated this compound, oleic acid. And what he discovered was that this acid makes an instinctive response on ants to pick up the thing that has it and carry it away. And actually, when ants die, they release oleic acid. So it causes any ant that's near the dead ant to pick it up and carry it out of the nest because they don't want that dead ant, dying and causing disease in the nest. And he found he could drop oleic acid on an ant, and another ant, any ant that was near that ant, would pick that ant up immediately and carry it away, kicking and waving, and like dump it in the dead ant pile. Because for an ant, it's all about the smell, it's not about the behavior. So it's like, dead man walking, just take him away and dump him. And the seeds are able to produce the same oleic acid smell that makes the ants instinctively respond and bring back the seeds, even if it's not really good for the nest. So, yeah.
Before we get too far away from the bees, we have a question from Valeria. Is it possible to find the specialist bees and introduce them into an ecosystem?
Well, so bees are actually pretty good dispersers. So like if you plant it, they will come, has been the main thing that has been found with bees. So for the most part, as long as it's like not a huge distance away, bees are gonna find new resources. If you have spring beauty in your yard, and then there's spring beauty not too far away, they're gonna find that resource. So, but to look for spring beauty, you do have to be out early in the morning. They usually strip the plants of all their pollen by about 10 o'clock in the morning and are back sleeping. So yeah, it's usually a fairly early morning activity to look for them.
Awesome. And how do bees find the male flowers?
How do they find them?
Yes.
So the spring beauty are actually perfect flowers. And so on the first day they're open, the male, they just have pollen. And then on the second day, the pollen, the anthers wither and the stigma comes up and they're female. And then that's it. They're a 2-day flower. So they're both part, but it's their male first, Protanius, or whatever, the male first. So okay, so anyway, so we know that ants are like this amazing dispersal agent for spring ephemerals, and do this amazing job at it. Because spring ephemerals, are found, these species, the distribution tends to be limited by where you find the ant species that do the distribution of their seed. So they're a limiting factor for spring ephemerals. And they found that trillium seeds, not all of them have the elaiosomes that are attractive to ants. And the ones that do have the oleic acid in, those ones are the more common trilliums, and the ones that don't have the oleic acid, they're the rare trilliums. Okay, so it's a really, makes a huge difference in how well you're going to survive if you're using this ant distribution. But one of the things that somebody realized is that if ants were the only things doing the distribution, all these spring ephemerals actually, back 16,000 years ago, they were way down in Georgia, was the only place where it was warm enough during the last ice age for these plants. And since then, they've expanded and marched 800 miles north. Now, if they were doing it by ant distribution, they would have only made it, like about 4 miles north. So something else is also distributing them. And do you remember those bears where they had to go through their poop to see what they were eating? Well, somebody went through the poop of these guys, our favorite herbivore, and discovered that there are viable ephemeral seeds that will grow once you sift their poop and take the seeds out of them. So always a great job being the naturalist poop sifter. And then you can prove that actually deer, which on average distribute seeds about 3 kilometers every year, are the agent that have managed to allow ephemerals to move north since the Ice Age. Okay, another strategy is, instead of like growing really, really fast in that window of opportunity, is to actually have something like a winter rosette that you keep through the winter, that then allows you to grow more quickly in springtime. And there's quite a few different plants, white averns and stuff, that do this, but I'm going to look at Eastern Columbine because it's a flower that I really like. And one of the reasons is, of course, that when I see my Eastern Columbine flowering, I know it's time, if I'm going to put out a hummingbird feeder, to put your feeder out, because they're, the arrival of hummingbirds coincides with when columbines tend to be flowering. So they have by having this winter rosette, they're one of the green things around and available to eat in the wintertime, when we have our herds of hungry deer who are like, oh, I want to break from all those twigs. And this looks like a great plant. But of course, so to avoid being eaten, you do need to have like cardiac glycosides or one of these other ones, and they have a cyanide compound in their leaves. So don't munch on your columbine leaves because they are toxic to mammals. But it's not, toxic for lots of insects. And there's actually tons of insects that will eat plants that are toxic to mammals. Now, I talk about a lot to people about planting natives in their yard for like pollinators because of my love of bees. But I also am really careful to also tell people that other things will eat your plants, but those animals are just as important because they're part of our food web. And but I'm just going to take you on a quick trip to show you how important these are. So if you've ever grown columbine, and please do, you might have seen that you almost always get these leaf miner patterns on your leaves. So this is a little tiny larvae that's munching between the top and bottom layer of the plant in its safe little zone there, eating its way through the plant and mostly staying safe from predators. And it's actually a little tiny fly that does this. But if you're a little tiny fly larva inside of the plant, you're not completely safe because there's a whole group of wasps, parasitic wasps, that are able to use their ovipositor, which is your stinger, to pierce through the leaf and actually put their egg inside of that leaf miner. So the Diglyphus wasp here is a specialist on this type of leaf miner fly. So they will control the population of leaf miners by parasitizing them. And then don't forget, of course, that hummingbird babies don't just grow on sugar. They need little insects like the flies and these tiny wasps as well. Oh, but if you're sitting on a leaf, you are also vulnerable to predators. And the main predators of these tiny insects tend to be tiny jumping spiders. So jumping spiders are really amazing animals. They can jump like, 50 times their length, having a little piece of silk behind them as an emergency bungee cord if in case they miss. But they use these great front eyes to be able to see that fly and judge and catch the fly or the wasp and eat it. Now, if you're a little tiny jumping spider, your main predator is going to be a great big jumping spider in comparison to you. And if you did see my mimic talk, you'll know that big jumping larger jumping spiders are such a major predator of smaller jumping spiders that smaller jumper spiders will pull tricks like mimicking being an ant because the jumping spider won't mess with an ant, to try and avoid this predation. Even to the extent that, like, if by mimicking an ant, they actually lose the ability to jump. The whole point of being a jumping spider. But it's better to look like an ant than to look like a jumping spider. So they'll give up that jumping ability. So here's a larger jumping spider, and it in turn is likely to be eaten by another parasitic wasp. So this one is, many of them get eaten by the mud dauber wasps, some of which specialize on orb web spiders, but the black and yellow mud dauber also really likes jumping spiders. The mud dauber spiders, collect mud, and then they find a nice bit of wall or a tree and they build their little mud home, and they take spiders that they've stung to paralyze them, but it doesn't kill them because they want their babies to eat nice fresh food, and they stuff them inside of their mud home and lay their egg on one of the bodies. So the larvae then eats these nice fresh, not quite dead spiders for their food. So these ones are like ectoparasites, so their eggs are laid on the outside, as opposed to the previous one, which was an endoparasite, because it laid its eggs inside of the fly larvae and ate it alive from the inside out. And then finally, one of the favorite treats of a bird that you really enjoy having in your yard, for the tufted titmouse, loves to find those mud dauber nests and will break them open to find the big fat grub that's hidden inside it. So this is like high quality food for a tufted titmouse in the winter, like plenty of fats and proteins, and help them survive through the winter. It's kind of interesting because we also have a non-native Crypsis wasp, which is a kleptoparasite. So a third type of wasp will also try and eat the mud dauber food. So it sneaks into the nest of the mud dauber, lays its eggs in there, and then it steals the food. So that's why it's a kleptoparasite on the mud dauber. Okay, I hope you liked that little journey through the food web of the columbine. So now we're back to different methods of surviving in the shade. So one of the ones is like, well, why collect your own food when you can steal the food that someone else has collected? So straight from that kleptoparasite into the parasitic plants. So these are all flowers that no longer, plants, sorry, that no longer produce chlorophyll because they don't need to produce their own food. So things like beech drops here and the squaw root are both plants that attach to the roots of in this case, the beech drops. I got that backwards, didn't I? The beech drops. It's epiphagus, so it goes on beech trees, and then so they not squaw root here, attaches to oak trees. So these plants, they have to land, the seed has to land close enough to the root of these plants to be able to actually attach. And basically what they do is mimic the mycorrhizal network that Serenella is going to talk about. And they kind of pretend like, oh, I'm a helpful fungi. And it's assumed that that's the way that they manage to get their roots into the roots of the oak or beech tree and then extract those foods, because these trees, I think they're actually feeding the fungal network. But what they're really doing is, stealing the energy from the oak or beech tree without any payback. Now, of course, they do it in very low amounts, so it doesn't really affect the health of the trees. But the really hard thing by being such a specialized parasite is, the chances of your seed landing close enough to the root of one of these trees is really low. So they actually are very like fungi in that they produce microscopically small seeds that are almost spore-like in the hundreds of thousands, and they release them to travel all over. And then when they land, those seeds, the spore-like seeds, are actually able to sense the chemical signals of their host tree. And so they don't germinate until they're able to sense that the roots of their host tree are close enough for them to reach. And they can sit just waiting in the soil for at least 10 years, waiting in the chance that the right type of root will kind of come closely by them. There's an even more fascinating kind of parasite in the woods, and that's the ghost pipe or Indian pipe, which does the same kind of trick, except it doesn't join onto the tree directly. It actually joins that mycorrhizal network. So it parasites on the fungus. So as far as we know, it doesn't hurt the fungus. What it's doing is it's taking the energy from a tree that's going into the fungal network and then tapping into that fungal network to steal the carbohydrates that it needs to survive. And of course, because it doesn't need any chlorophyll to produce its own food, that's why it has this ghostly white pallor. Its leaves have pretty much disappeared because it doesn't need them anymore. All it needs is those roots that it's going to attach. And it particularly goes after two different types, the Russula and the Lactarius fungi. And I won't cover any more just in case Serenella is doing this stuff next week. Okay, so there's another way of surviving. And that's basically, instead of trying to be the hare that we talked about at the beginning that does its whole life cycle really fast, you can just actually relax and chill in the shade and accept your position as I'm down here in the dark and I'm just going to be happy to be here. And so you're going to be your turtle and just, go with the flow. And the plants that do this are ones that we see still in leaf through the full summer time when all those ephemerals are actually all dying back or have already disappeared. So a really classic example of this is spicebush. And this rather complicated one. I just wanted to make sure that you do know that I actually do science. So I put in graphs, look, graphs. So these graphs are showing the amount of sunlight that falls on any day of the year. So if you're out in the open, you get like, you know, some days it's cloudy, some days it's not, and you get a certain amount of sunlight during that day. And in this, on the same days, it's showing like how much sunlight you get if you're growing in the understory. So until the trees leaf out, you obviously get almost the same amount. And then as soon as the tree canopy closes on day 120 or whatever of the year, study was done in Maryland, then you're not going to get very much sunlight whatsoever. But what's happened is the plants that live there have adapted to being able to live in these shady conditions. So really, they've just become like super efficient plants. So these are like the Prius of the plant world. So they take a tiny amount of like sunlight, their gas inputs, and make it go a really long way. And the way they do this is by having very broad, flat leaves. So they're really good at catching every bit of sunlight. And then they have a very thin leaf so that most of the sunlight is able to penetrate those photons of light, can penetrate and get to their chloroplasts, and they're able to, you know, use those bits of sunlight more efficiently. And what they discovered is that things like spicebush actually grow more, you know, they grow more mass when they have it. It's about 25% of the total sunlight that's available. And if you give them more than that, they actually slow their growth rate. And the other thing they do is they're in full sunlight, their leaves have to get a lot thicker because they need to protect themselves from the detrimental effects of UV light. I mean, we all know that like too much UV light on like white skin like mine, and you know, you can get sunburned and then skin cancers. And in the same way, too much UV can be bad for plants, and they actually in full light, they have to protect themselves from those harmful rays. So they grow much thicker leaves. And this actually is a big impact because things like the herbivores, like the spicebush swallowtail, is actually adapted to eat the thin leaves, not the thick leaves, and they can't thrive on these open, you know, spicebush that are growing in full sunlight. Now, the really important thing though about spicebush in terms of the impacts on our woodlands is their fruit. So the fruit of the spicebush is like an incredibly densely packed ball of nutrients. The spicebush is actually pretty closely related to avocados, or in the same Lariaceae family. And the fruit themselves have about 50% fat in them. And that fat is something that, you know, a lot of our migratory birds are really seeking out. They've got to put on a layer of fat all over their bodies that's going to supply the fuel on their migrations back to Central America. And if you've ever been out in the woodlands, and luckily for us, you know, because of their deer resistance, these bushes can be very common in our understory in woodlands in Maryland. But when you walk around, what you'll notice is the ripe berries don't last. As soon as they're red, they start disappearing. The birds really preferentially seek out these seeds to eat. And there's actually been quite a few studies that show they actually we're back to the fecal pellets at this point and sifting through for seeds. So there was a big study done in Massachusetts where they caught birds through mist netting. They would pop them in a paper bag for an hour, and then hopefully they got a little fecal pellet from a particular known bird, and they could look at them to see what those birds were eating. And what they discovered was that the birds were preferentially eating these seeds that had the really high fat contents. Even if they weren't the most abundant, they could be like at quite low abundances. You know, there might be only 5% of the berries that were available in an area, but they would, you know, some of them were making up like 90% and stuff of the seeds that they were getting by doing their fecal pellet sifting. So the life of the naturalist, we all love it. So yeah, so what they found when they compared these different seeds is that many of our native seeds that they were preferentially going after were, you know, these native ones that have these really high fat contents, and they were ignoring a lot of these low fat contents seeds. But it's kind of interesting because a few other studies, of course, have found that some of the more generalist birds like robins will eat a lot of these non-native seeds because of their high sugar content. And they're the ones that are really helping to spread them out. So, you know, some studies have shown that in an area where invasives actually are the majority of the seeds available, if you just remove all of the invasives, you're going to take away the food for these generalists, frugivores that are really now depending on the non-natives. So it's a really complicated thing trying to sort out. So basically it means if you go to an area and you're trying to remove invasives, you should really have a plan in place for replacing it with natives, so that, you know, there's still the food sources that will be higher quality available for those birds as well. Okay, I want to crack on with my autumn. Hooray! So of course you don't have to live in the shade. You could be a tree and like live and get as much sunlight as you want. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the coolest of our trees. The oak tree is not the most common. Yellow poplar, the tulip poplar, is the most common tree in Maryland. But the oak trees are probably our most important in terms of the contributions that they make to wildlife and the impacts they have on them. And if you've ever done anything to do with native plantings, you probably know all about Doug Tallamy. So I'm not going to mention a word about that. I'm going to talk about acorns because we're in the fall time now. So you might know that like oak trees, you know, produce these acorns. And we've always traditionally think of like squirrels as the big thing that like collect them and hide them so they, you know, scatter, cache the acorns around. And some of them they're going to find and some not. So they are going to like help with planting these acorns. Now they do like quite selective job on what they do. And one of the really big contributions to squirrels actually is if they collect an acorn, pick up an acorn, they can tell if it's infested with acorn weevils, which are actually the most important predator of acorns is acorn weevils. They destroy more acorns than anything else. And if they can tell it's got acorn weevils in, they will actually usually eat it right there and then because that acorn will not store. The weevils have destroyed the acorn. And they get the extra protein of the weevils, and they're also helping to control the weevil population, which is one of the biggest contributions that squirrels are actually making to the oak tree. Now, you might know that we have two main type families of oak trees. There's the red and the white. The white have these really big acorns for the most part, and they have really low tannin contents, which makes them super appealing to squirrels because they're not as bitter. But white oak germinate in the fall of the year that they fall. So, and then they don't want to cache them and for them to sprout because then they lose a lot of the energy that they would want to eat themselves. So they actually grab the white acorns and they either eat them immediately or they excise the embryo from out of the acorn to stop them growing before they cache them. And if you do that, they actually cache better than the reds. They'll store and be good for up to 6 months. The red acorns, they tend to like cache more because they don't germinate till the following spring. So you can like store those through the winter. Now, in a year when there's masting, that the acorns, the oak trees produce lots of acorns. They can hide all their acorns and like they go kind of crazy and they store way more acorns than they actually need in the winter unless it's a really harsh winter. And so on masting years, they might actually only retrieve about 25% of those acorns. So they do a pretty good job of like planting acorns, which is of course what the oak tree wants to happen. In non-masting years, they can retrieve up to 95% of them, but they don't distribute them very far from the original oak tree. So they only take them on average, I think it's about 40 to 50 feet is the average distance maximum that they're taking these squirrel acorns and caching them. So because the further they travel, obviously the longer time before they can come back and get more acorns. And squirrels are pretty obsessive about collecting their acorns, have you noticed? And there's tons of really great studies that are really fun to read, all about how when they hide their acorns, some squirrels are thieves and they watch other squirrels, and if for where the caching has happened, and as soon as that squirrel's left, they go over and steal those acorns and move them to a new location where only they know where they are. And it's funny because the squirrels that are thieves assume that other squirrels will also be thieves.
Would you unmute yourself, Claire? Sorry. Thank you.
Am I back on?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Did you miss anything or?
A couple sentences.
Okay. Anyway, so if you're a thief, then you're always suspicious that every other squirrel might be a thief. And if the honest squirrels actually trust other squirrels and they don't do the fake caching. So I find it really amusing that it's the thieves that don't trust the other squirrels. Okay, the acorns have a much bigger impact on our environment. There we go. You might imagine. So we all know, hopefully, that oak trees mast. So in a study, most of them mast like somewhere between every 2 years to every 6 years that they mast. And when they mast, they produce huge amounts of acorns, and on other years they don't. In a study that was done in Maryland over an 11-year period, the 2 years when it masted actually produced 55% of all the acorns that fell in those 11 years fell in just those 2 years. So there's like a huge amount of acorns and then not many acorns at all. And this like huge change in the amount availability of acorns has massive repercussions through the ecosystem. So not surprisingly, the year after a mast year, the populations of animals that eat acorns will hugely expand. So the white-footed mouse over here doubles its population in the spring following a mast year. Now this has repercussions because a favorite food of white-footed mice are gypsy moth pupa. So when they studied gypsy moth populations, what they discovered was that there was a close correlation between the year that has a oak mast, the following year have very low gypsy moth populations because of the expanded population of white-footed mice. Now you might also know that unfortunately white-footed mice are like the main reservoir of Bufus Borelli Bergdorferi, which is the spirochetes of Lyme disease. So in order to spread Lyme disease, black-legged tick or deer tick here, the nymphs have to bite an infected deer mouse. So the year after masting, when there's this huge population of white-footed mice, lots of nymphs will bite white-footed mice and catch Lyme disease. Those nymphs, will spend the winter and then emerge the following spring as adults who then are looking for larger vertebrate hosts, mostly deer, but unfortunately also people. And so 2 years after a masting year, we actually have really high deer tick population spreading Lyme disease. So we have this cycle: mast, low gypsy moth next year, then the year after that, high Lyme disease. So we have these cycles rolling through because of the impacts that acorns have. What's really interesting, I think, about oak trees is that the main animal that actually is dispersing those that's growing baby oak trees is actually our blue jays. They are way, way more important for our oak trees than the squirrels are. And that's because they just love picking up acorns, flying them away and planting them. A study that was done in Virginia, they looked at a single family of blue jays that were visiting a stand of 11 pin oaks. And this is kind of incredible to me, but the one family picked up and moved 135,000 acorns, moved them an average of 1 kilometer but up to 2 kilometers away from the oak tree, and then planted them in the ground. They would push them into the ground and cover them with a little bit of leaf and soil to hide them. And then corvids are really smart, but they actually have a pretty low retrieval rate. So only about 25% of those acorns are getting retrieved. So corvids do this amazing job of spreading oak trees. And so just like with those ants where we couldn't understand how the spring ephemerals could be traveling so fast, the same thing was true with oak trees. Until they realized that most oak trees are actually planted by blue jays, they couldn't understand why oaks migrate so fast. So the oak trees get planted by the acorns, and they're so good at this that there's actually conservation projects going on in like the Santa Cruz Islands in California, where they have bird feeders that they put up in areas that have been impacted by forest fires, and they just put on the bird feeder piles and piles of live oak, scrub oak, acorns, and allow the jays to come in, collect these seeds and take them off and plant them all over the deforested areas. And some people in Sweden actually did the calculation, and they said that the amount of work that jays do doing the planting, it would cost $3,800 per acre to have people do the amount of planting that blue jays are doing. So blue jays, they're a lot cooler birds than people give them credit for. Okay, I think I must be close on time. Yep. So, Serenella, did you need me to wrap up? Are you still there? Oh, she's
yes,
muted
please.
out. Sorry?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let me just finish by saying go outside and look at witch hazel, which is just finishing flowering now. It's the last plant pretty much to flower here in Maryland. It's a really amazing thing that it flowers this late, and it actually has a specialist pollinator, which is a moth that does that thermogenesis that the skunk cabbage was doing. It raises its body temperature by shivering and having a furry body, so it can go and pollinate these full flowering flowers when there's not many other pollinators about. And they're going to pollinate, and then next year they have delayed implantation of the pollen, so they don't actually grow the seeds till next spring, and then they fire them off like this time next year. So it's like this really bizarre thing that witch hazels do, and they fire them as cannons, just like Touch Me Not jewelweed does, and fire them out about 30 feet away from the plant. So they do this really cool job. Okay, and so I'm going to wrap up there, but just look, we have a few evergreens, and there we go. Last one, I made it. Sorry, Serenella.
It's all good. It was a wonderful presentation, and I enjoyed learning all of those wonderful secrets that the forest is doing. At this point, I would like to invite the audience, whether it is with your voice or in the chat box, to ask any burning questions that you have still for Clare. Justin would like to share that. Thank you so much. So many details about our common species. All right, I see. Valeria would like to know, if there are no spring beauties around me, how would the bees find me?
Okay, so one thing is sometimes there are flowers that we just don't know about. So I can tell you this quick story about a specialist bee that's a specialist on heuchera. And until recently, this bee was only known from states from the west of West Virginia and further west. But someone went to look for this bee in Mount in Delaware. I'm trying to remember the name, Mount Cuba. They went to look for this bee in Mount Cuba by looking at their really large heuchera collections that they had there, and they caught the bee. And so they caught a bee that the nearest record of that bee existing was the very west of West Virginia. And so we kind of assumed that that bee was around, but just in such small numbers that we didn't know it was there. And then it managed to find this collection of planted heuchera that was put into Mount Cuba. So, one of the things, with bees for the most part is if you plant it, they will come. But they do, you need to have a big enough patch of spring beauty for them to go like, oh, this is worth coming and visiting. So. But yeah, it's impossible to kind of move them. So you just have to hope they naturally migrate to your bees, to your spring beauty.
Wonderful. Just a quick reminder to our audience, if you're just catching up because of the change in time, don't worry. We are still recording, and I will make sure that this recording makes it to all of your inboxes. We have an additional question. When did you say that the witch hazel shoots out the seeds?
So usually it's from August onwards that they ripen and start shooting. So it's kind of one of my ambitions to actually see them. I've just heard reports that it's loud enough when it happens, you can kind of hear them going. And that they can go up to 30 feet, that people have measured them, which seems really ambitious. I'm sure that's like with a following wind or something like that, that could blow them that far. But because they don't have that's their only method of seed dispersal. So most witch hazels in an area are all going to be close relatives, because they find it hard to transport their seed further away. And actually has impacts on the witch hazel because they won't accept pollen from a close relative. So they've had very low success of their flowers becoming fertilized. It's about 1% of all their flowers actually become fertilized and turn into seeds because of the fact that they usually don't get pollen from a distant relative, which is why it's hard to see the cannons being shot off, but I'm hoping to one day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. Again, wonderful as always. I just want to remind our audience that we have two Naturalist Hour talks coming up next week. On Tuesday, it's going to be me, and you will be enjoying, hopefully, my common shenanigans and talking about how the forest is all chatting under your feet. And then on November 25th, we'll have the best storyteller in the region, the capital naturalist, Alonso Abugatas, will be with us. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. Claire, Wonderful as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.